Okay. Well, I think I will start this webinar. And first of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Harold Bok. I'm a veterinarian from the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, Utrecht University. Appointed there at the Center for Quality Improvement in Veterinary Education. From origin, I graduated as a veterinarian, and now already since almost 10 years, mainly involved in education, as a teacher, as a researcher, and mainly in assessment, competency-based education, and workplace-based assessment. Okay, now I will start my presentation and share my screen with you. And hopefully my screen, the presentation is visible for you all. Okay, I'm not hearing any complaints. So
at the moment, I don't see your presentation.
No?
No,
Don't see the presentation. Let's see. Is it visible now? Tried something else.
Yes, now it's
Yes.
good. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon, and I feel really honored to be provided with the opportunity to have this talk during, I think, the first Blended Leru conference. And during the next, I think, 40 minutes, I will share with you our experiences from the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine in Utrecht in the very interesting journey we went through while designing and implementing a programmatic approach to assessment in our competency-based veterinary curriculum. Well, after the presentation, there, of course, will be some time for questions, and also we could have a discussion afterwards using the Slack environment. Okay, I will start the journey we went through by telling you about the reasons why we changed our curriculum, the design of our new program of assessment, the implementation strategy we followed, the evaluation and research results, and finally, the lessons we've learned over the years. So, what actually were the incentives for change? Well, there must have been very good reasons why we put ourselves into all this trouble. And, well, we think there were good reasons. During the last 3 decades in Utrecht at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, we had several curriculum renewals. And, however, these curricular transformations were mainly limited to the preclinical phase of our program. We have a clinical and a preclinical phase, and for some reason, still 2007, the clinical phase mainly stayed the same. However, with the mandatory change in EU regulations that followed from the Bologna Agreement in 1999, we had to reform our curriculum again into a bachelor, a preclinical program, and a master, a clinical program. And at this time, that moment, also the clinical clerkships had to change. A simple reason was that the program went from a 2 to a 3-year program. So, yeah, where to start? Well, in 2009, we performed a SWOT analysis, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, to see what the opportunities for improvement would be for our clinical program. And this analysis actually revealed some very clear weaknesses. Well, firstly, no to very limited feedback that was provided to our students was based on direct observations of students performing in the clinical setting. The learning strategies in the clerkships were not focused on cycles of reflection and improvement based on feedback, and therefore we had insufficient insight in the longitudinal development of our students. Students' learning was mainly driven by written knowledge tests they had once in a while, and actually we weren't able to discriminate between students' performance, at least not documented, and therefore it was almost impossible to remediate low or reward high-performing students. And for all those reasons, the clerkships felt more like a patchwork without visual alignment between educational strategies and the program outcomes. All these weaknesses mentioned demanded a big change in how we had organized, and designed, and implemented our educational strategies. However, most of all, what we find out is that there was really a need to change the learning culture within our teaching hospitals and clerkship programs. And what turned out was that changing a learning culture was quite an ambitious plan, and still is. But in the Netherlands, we like to address challenges, and so in 2009 we started with the design phase for our new clinical master's curriculum. And what does our new program look like? So our curriculum, as I told, consists of a 3-year pre-clinical bachelor program, mainly consisting of courses thematically organized around organ systems. And the first students for that bachelor program enrolled in September 2007. And after successfully finishing the bachelor program, students are allowed to enter the 3-year master program. This program mainly consists of clinical rotations, elective courses, and the research thesis. And the majority of our training during this program take place within one of our 3 teaching hospitals. And furthermore, students also have more extramural training in primary care veterinary practices across the country. Now, the first students in this program started in September 2010. Well, each year, 225 students will enroll in our bachelor program and approximately 200 students in our master program. So it is this 3-year clinically oriented master program for which we developed a programmatic approach toward learning and assessment. So for our master program, we started to develop a program of assessment that covers the entire pyramid of Miller, which you see here on the right side of the slide. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this pyramid, it represents the different levels on which clinical competence can be assessed. Each level asks for different methods of assessment, and eventually the ultimate goal of learning and assessment in a clinical learning environment is developing competence to be able to perform independently in the authentic setting, and in our case, the authentic clinical setting. For the lower levels of Miller's pyramid, that refer to the cognitive levels, so the knows and the knows-how, we've included several different types of assessment methods, mainly written assessment, into our program of assessment. However, if we want to have a look at the more behavioral aspects and assess whether a student is able to demonstrate competence in a simulated or in an authentic environment, we had to use other tools, other assessment tools. And it is exactly for this workplace-based learning that we applied a programmatic approach to assessment and introduced an e-portfolio, actually, to meaningfully combine workplace learning and assessment. And in order to develop our e-portfolio and the forms within it and the strategies related to it, we used the theoretical model for programmatic assessment introduced by Kees van der Vleuten. But first, why did we choose to use an e-portfolio in order to foster learning and assessment in the clinical workplace in relation to programmatic assessment? Well, when having a closer look at the scientific evidence available from educational literature, we know that to become an expert in a certain field, you need to do more than just gaining experience in that field. This doing more is what can be referred to as deliberate practice. This requires active reflection from the learner on their performance and the feedback they have received in order to improve performance or improve clinical performance. And when taking a closer look at the definition of deliberate practice, it characterizes training as the learner being focused on improvement of performance. And this performance is then carefully monitored to provide cues to achieve improvement and eventually reach well-defined goals. So the learner needs to assess his or her own performance and subsequently need to formulate new learning goals. And so deliberate practice in the workplace environment is based on looking back on previous actions in order to take steps for improvement. And this is very nicely illustrated by the ALACT cycle described by Korthagen in literature, in educational literature. And it is also clear that for learners to accurately look back on their actions and to assess their performance, they need to receive feedback from a variety of sources, like their peers, supervisors, for example, in our case, nurses they collaborate with, etc. And it is this process of looking back on action, being aware of essential aspects for improvement, and the creation of alternative methods of action where an e-portfolio can be of relevance. However, in his paper, Are Learning Portfolios Worthy Effort?, Erik Driessen mentioned that introducing portfolios is just like buying new shoes. One size doesn't fit all. And actually careful fitting is essential. So unfortunately, there is no perfect recipe for a portfolio or for a design for programmatic assessment. And implementation and the design really depends on the specific goals and the context of an individual curriculum. But what we do know from literature about how a portfolio could foster deliberate practice is that it could help to schedule in when a learner is being observed and provided formative feedback by a supervisor in daily practice. Furthermore, it could help to visualize received feedback and therefore could make the feedback more relevant. Portfolio could help to promote reflection on previous performance and received feedback. And as a consequence, it could foster self-directed learning. It provides guidance for mentoring, and it can aggregate and visualize multiple assessment or multiple feedback data points over time for both learning and decision-making functions. And finally, it can provide us with a wealth of learning analytics regarding students' learning behavior. So, a portfolio can serve as a constitution of all sorts of assessment information, including the learner's reflection on this information, with the main focus on the top of Miller's pyramid, fostering deliberate practice. So to see why this could be useful, we first have to take a closer look at the assessment literature. Therefore, I would like to introduce the utility index concerning assessment instruments. And this index describes 5 topics that are important in relation to the utility of an assessment tool. Of course, acceptability and costs are also important, but for now I will only discuss what is known from literature with respect to validity, reliability, and educational impact, and hopefully make my point why we choose a programmatic approach to assessment with respect to the top levels of Miller's pyramid. With respect to validity, it is known from literature that a multitude of different methods is required to cover all the different aspects of clinical competence, so to cover the entire pyramid. When looking at reliability, it is known that we need a lot of different data points from different sources, different contexts, different methods, And the literature on educational impact shows us the essential importance of providing meaningful information directed to learning with each assessment. So providing formative information with each assessment. And these insights resulted in the introduction of the theoretical model concerning the programmatic approach to assessment. And in his paper from 2012, Kees van der Vleuten defined this theory as an integral approach to the design of an assessment program with the intent to optimize its learning function, its decision function, and its curriculum quality assurance function. And this perfectly aligns actually with the main goals we wanted in Utrecht to accomplish with our e-portfolio, namely to maximally support the students' learning process and to robustly assess students' performance. So when taking a closer look at the objectives we formulated in Utrecht in 2009 for the portfolio based on a programmatic approach to assessment, these were the following. The portfolio and the components within had to visualize and provide insight in students' longitudinal development. That's first. The main focus with each assessment had to lie on providing meaningful, formative feedback to the student. The assessment methods used had to align with the educational strategies applied within the clinical workplace. It had to enhance reflective behavior and self-directed learning. And finally, the portfolio had to allow faculty to make robust, high-stakes decisions about promotion or even about licensure. And in essence, the programmatic approach to assessment facilitated by the e-portfolio needed to integrate learning and assessment in an effective way so that the two main goals of our assessment program actually were the ability to apply assessment for learning and assessment of learning. So what did our design actually look like? Well, the portfolio is made up of several assessment forms. In our case, we mainly use a mini clinical evaluation exercise. And for those of you who are not familiar with medical education, such a assessment form allows you to document the feedback you want to give to a student after an observation. And usually this is a very short observation. So in our case, for example, a student performing a physical examination of a dog that's observed by a teacher, and the teacher fill in the feedback within this mini clinical evaluation exercise. Multi-source feedback. I think you're all familiar with the multi-source feedback. An evidence-based case report. That evidence-based case report is a report of a case, an interesting case a student encountered during their rotations. And it usually is a 3 to 4 page report, which is scored on the scholarly abilities, scientific writing skills of a student. And a personal development plan, and the personal development plan is meant to help students reflect on a previous period of rotations, reflect on the feedback they received during that period, and formulate new goals for the upcoming period. Well, the portfolio and the forms within it are all aligned based on the VetPro competency framework, which you see here on the left. And this framework consists of 7 competency domains. And all the forms are aligned, all the forms, assessment forms within the portfolio are aligned based on this framework. And that allows us to longitudinally aggregate all the assessment data and visualize actually performance development over time. All the individual forms here on the right are focused on formative feedback. and the student uses them to keep track on his or her development and to identify strengths and weaknesses. And every student is guided by a mentor, and that mentor helps the students with this formative process of translating the feedback into new learning goals for an upcoming period. And that's done by meetings twice a year, individual meetings between the student and mentor. Well, after 2 years, the portfolio is summatively assessed by an assessment committee, and later on I will discuss that in more depth. Well, here you can see a schematic overview of how we design the programmatic approach towards workplace learning and assessment. Each block over here represents different rotations, different clerkships, in which students have to collect minimum required numbers of workplace-based feedback forms or assessment forms. After every 6 months, the student has a meeting with his or her mentor to discuss the received feedback and their performance over the last months, and to discuss the learning goals and objectives formulated for the next 6 months. Well, after 2 years, students' progress as documented in the portfolio is then summatively assessed. So in summary, we could say that when the stakes of the assessment increase, more and a bigger variety of assessment data points is used in order to judge performance. And this is very nicely, I think, illustrated by a figure that I borrowed from Kees van der Vleuten. As you can see here on the left, when not much is at stake, for example, to evaluate students' performance for a single activity or on a single day during a rotation, one assessment data point could do the job. This assessment will then provide the student with useful feedback, formative feedback that could be helpful to improve performance regarding a specific activity or for the next day. For a student-mentor meeting, every 6 months, one single data point, of course, will not be enough to foster a meaningful discussion about students' performance and development over the last months, and more data points are required. Well, the information collected in a variety of contexts from a variety of assessors will then be informative during the student-mentor meeting, in which there is a focus, or has to be a focus, on diagnosis, prediction, remediation. However, if we want to make a decision about promotion or even licensure at the end of training, we really need to be confident about this decision. And this requires a multitude of assessment data points. And this then should provide us with a clear picture of students' clinical performance, and consequently allow us to make a robust, high-stake decision. Important to notice is that because the portfolio provides the student with an overview of his or her performance over time, the results of this high-stake assessment should, of course, not be a surprise for the student. So, how do we present the assessment data to the learners? Well, we use an e-portfolio system. It has some nice features that visualizes students' development over time. Here you can see a spider diagram illustrating different levels of competence compared to individual scores compared to the cohort scores. And here you can see a graph showing students' development on a certain competency domain over time. In Utrecht, mentoring is an essential aspect of our curriculum at the vet school, and key in successfully implementing a programmatic approach to assessment. But What do we mean when talking about mentoring in Utrecht? I think this definition describes it quite well. It's a faculty member offering advice, information, guidance, support, or opportunity to another, in our case, to a student. And to explain why mentoring is so important for the programmatic approach, I can best try to explain it by using the self-determination theory. And self-determination theory explains motivational processes and can help to understand and foster this important component of learning. Self-determination theory is based on three basic psychological needs. The need for autonomy, the need for competence, and the need for relatedness. And mentoring is actually important to encourage all three. First, autonomy, which is reflected by the experience that behavior is an expression of the self and generates a complete feeling of free will to choose whatever a person desires or considers useful to do. Competence, because that refers to the desire to feel effective in whatever actions one performs. And relatedness, because that refers to the desire to feel connected with others, being part of a team, having a sense of belongingness. And it is the mentoring that can play a crucial role in fostering all these three psychological needs and, as a consequence, foster self-determination. And literature shows that when done right, mentoring could result in better career preparation, more efficient workplace-based learning, better professional development, and of course for the mentor, I'm also a mentor of a lot of students in our program. It's a very rewarding and a very nice experience to follow a student and see them develop in over a period of 6 years. I was actually also very lucky to have had an excellent mentor during an important phase in my own professional career during my PhD. So, based on our previous experience and evidence from the literature, we designed our programmatic approach to assessment. And now the only minor thing we needed to do was to implement it. Well, developing a good implementation strategy often not receive the attention it should get. And also we experienced that actually this was key for the program to be successful or not. So what were we dealing with? Well, first we had to deal with the conflicting interests in our case that exist between educational, commercial objectives within the clinical setting. Furthermore, as active involvement from the clinicians was essential for our design to succeed, we had to make sure that education was felt as a priority, or is felt as a priority, besides patient care and research. Coaching and supervising students had to be part of the professional identity of our faculty members. And finally, we had to deal with the fact that all our clinicians were trained in a different way and were not used at all to provide meaningful feedback that's focused on improvement while observing students. So as mentioned before, our biggest challenge was actually to change, and still is, to change the assessment culture within our teaching hospitals, but also during all of our clinical rotations. Where did we start it during the implementation process? How did we eventually create the support we needed for change? Well, first, and I think most important for us, was to have all the important stakeholders involved from the start. So then I'm talking about our head of education, our dean. They needed to be supportive and had to show commitment to the new plans. Of course, I also mean the preceptors, so clinicians, teachers, and very important also the students. but also our educational management and support officers had to be involved from the start on. Another important step was that we initiated a project team consisting of the most influential clinicians, student representatives, and some faculty from our educational management. And it was actually this participatory approach that turned out to be quite successful, as all important stakeholders were involved in the design and implementation and therefore felt responsible for the new program to succeed. Furthermore, of course, we had to be very clear about the reasons for change and the goals we had with the new assessment program. And besides this, we also developed a plan to measure if we were able to accomplish our goals. We started the PhD project. It was my own project from a design-based research perspective that evaluated the new program of assessment. And over the years, we've also started 3 other PhD projects, also for the same purpose. And in essence, the implementation phase came down to the project team, training faculty, training students, gaining experience with the new program, evaluating the results, making necessary adjustments to the program, and over again. And this all required a lot of communication, explanation, discussion, listening to people's concerns, and that's over and over again. In the meantime, we have implemented our new master program with the programmatic approach to assessment since 2010. So after 8 years, we should be able to say if we have accomplished our goals. Well, in order to say something about reaching our objectives, we use the following data sources. Well, the different PhD projects, of course. We started along the way about specific areas of the assessment program, and also the results from structural quality evaluations from students and clinicians. And to decide whether our new program of assessment functioned effectively, we had to look at the 2 goals we defined while designing. Well, first, of course, the ability to maximally enhance student learning, and secondly, the ability to make robust, high-stakes assessments. To start with the first objective, it turned out that providing high-quality feedback was troublesome for a lot of clinicians. They weren't used to it and turned out to be very difficult to allocate time and give priority for this. Furthermore, the feedback students received on their performance, and that was documented in their workplace-based assessments forms, and those were meant to be formative, unfortunately often were perceived as summative instead of formative. Well, and these results emphasize the essential importance for us of the implementation process, and we started offering additional training opportunities, but most importantly also try to create and allocate time for observation and feedback to occur within a busy clinical setting. Also from other literature, we know that providing high quality and meaningful feedback can be difficult. Providing formative feedback is a challenge. And I think this section highlights the different problems with feedback very nicely. And it justifies why we maybe need to think about feedback from another point of view if we actually want to generate feedback that makes a difference. And as there's a group of researchers in Australia that has done some very interesting work regarding feedback and has introduced a different definition. And in this, feedback is described as a process enacted over time with loops, and a process that results in change in work. And this definition implies actually a longitudinal process in which performance relevant information is exchanged and underlines also the importance of documenting and visualizing formative feedback received from, for example, workplace-based assessments. So it's really to create a dialogue between students and their teachers that also allow for follow-up of received feedback. Well, one of the assumptions of our program is that our students are able to learn over time. And also that's as a consequence that we are able to visualize this important for the students, but also for ourselves. Well, in a study that is currently in press and hopefully will appear online this week or next week, and that I will post on our Slack channel, we analyzed the results of 962 students, containing a total of more than 300,000 assessment data points from more than 16,000 assessment forms. And the learning curve in this figure here on the left represents the mean scores over time, collapsed across student, method and competency domain. And as you can see, over a 2-year, a little bit more than a 2-year period, there is a nice sigmoidal shape of the curve showing that students show development over time, and that we are able to visualize it using the programmatic approach of assessment. Well, the figure here on the right illustrates progression of performance within competency domains, within the different competency domains. And interesting is that you can see that the domain scores from veterinary expertise and scholarship consistently are a little bit lower than the scores from the other domains. Well, the results also show that scores from each assessment method over time demonstrated reliability, that we see a positive development of competencies over time, and that the majority of the variance in scores was student-related. That's actually what we wanted to see. Well, this is quite a lot of complex information, and well, as soon as the paper is available online, I will post it on our Slack channel, so that you can read it can go through it with a lot of additional explanation. Objective 2. Our second objective was the ability to make a robust, high-stakes decision. Well, I will first shortly explain how we have organized the portfolio assessment procedure. We have established a portfolio assessment committee existing out of 11 senior clinicians. And after 2 years, each portfolio from each student is evaluated by 2 independent assessors. They score the portfolio on competency development based on criteria per competency domain, and they also provide for each competency domain qualitative feedback to the students. So this results in a final score and feedback from each assessor. The scores are given on a 4 to 10 scale, and below 6 in the Netherlands means remediation. When there is a difference between the scores of the 2 independent assessors, a third assessor will review the portfolio. So to see how this turned out to work in practice, we evaluated the scores of 392 students over a 2-year period. And it turned out that the scores allowed us to differentiate between low, so a 4 and a 5 and a 6 performing students, and high performing students, so the 8 and the 9. In total, 37 students, that's almost 10%, failed the assessment and had to go through some form of remediation before they were able to continue. In 13 of the cases, a third assessor was required. And in 1.5%, there was a 2-point difference. We had 0 cases with more than 2 points difference between the 2 independent assessors. And I think more importantly to know is that the final scores were usually no surprise for our students. We only had a handful of complaints afterwards, and those complaints mainly related to students that were given a 7 and wanted an 8 because that will allow them in the Netherlands to graduate with honors. So what did we learn after a decade of implementing and having a programmatic approach to assessment in competency-based clinical in our competency-based clinical program? Well, first and most important, I think that it is, in our case, it is essential to find some sort of compromise between educational objectives and educational strategies and the clinical setting. So you have to try to create time and space for supervisors that is explicitly allocated to observation of performance and feedback. We have to try to foster supervisor continuity in more longitudinally clinical rotations, clerkships, because this will allow a feedback dialogue to occur and allow the establishment of professional relationships between student and supervisors to foster the dialogue. Try to make students essential members of the clinical team that will allow them to gradually receive increasing responsibilities. And in our case, it's we need to try, and we're trying to organize feedback about competency development that's really based on the observation of authentic and relevant clinical tasks. Furthermore, the students helped us and are still helping us to have a lean and user-friendly and very simple e-portfolio system to document and visualize the formative feedback. What we also learned is that changing the assessment culture and the learning culture, actually the feedback culture, is challenging, and that it's still an ongoing process. It requires training of students about what the objectives are of the program of assessment. You need to make them aware about their own goals, their own motives, and also the own role they have within education, and try to enhance proactive behavior in seeking feedback. On the other hand, it also requires training of clinicians about also the objectives of the program of assessment. You need to make them aware about their own perceived professional identity, and you need to try to change the departmental learning culture to one that's focused on the exchange of feedback. And last, it requires the training of mentors in a way that they are able to foster self-determination. And, well, most of all, it requires a lot of time and perseverance and still ongoing training of all the different stakeholders. And I would really like to conclude this webinar with one final statement, and that's with respect to the implementation of educational innovation, and in our case, the programmatic approach to assessment. We learned that good practice really asks for an individual approach that is specifically designed within the contextual restraints and in alignment with curricular goals and in alignment with local learning, teaching, and assessment strategy. It really is the implementation and the users that are eventually going to use the educational innovation that is key. Okay, yeah, and as soon as we think we're there will always be a new mountain to climb for us, and different roads to take, leading to some unexpected results. And well, I would like to thank you all for your attention. And there now will be time for some questions, but also there will be time for questions later on through the Slack channel. And there I will also post this PowerPoint, and as soon as the paper is out, I will also put the paper on the Slack channel. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this for this interesting presentation. It's astonishing how much you can go into the changement of teaching culture with this e-portfolio use.
Yeah.
And that's why I asked a few questions in the chat.
Yeah.
But I do not want to go ahead. Maybe other participants also have questions, and so let's see.
Let's see. We didn't say, but I'm wondering which portfolio system you used. Yeah, we're using the EPOS system. Well, that's a portfolio system that's developed by a company called Matteum. They originate from the University of Maastricht. So it's called EPOS. And on the internet you can find a lot of information about that. Let's see. Do you roll out this assessment model throughout I think you mean the entire veterinary faculty? I see a question. Yeah. Well, now we have it for the master program, and not yet for the bachelor program. In 2020, we will update our current master program. So then we can try to address the challenges we encountered so far, and try to optimize our master program. And probably in 2022 or 23, maybe we are going to update our bachelor program. And I think to implement a programmatic approach to assessment in our bachelor program, we really need a big curriculum change, because that means that you need to align all the different courses, align all content within the courses with your learning goals, program outcomes, etc. So that's a big change. Let's see, how do you prepare the students for learning with the e-portfolio? Yeah, we train them. It was a mandatory training program. Since 2 years, it's not mandatory anymore, and well, we're not really satisfied about that. So since for next year, we are going to make it a mandatory program again. So you really need to explain the students why we think they have to use the e-portfolio system, and why it is important for them to collect feedback, about formative feedback, about their performance, what they can learn from it, what their own role can be within such a program. And if you explain it, then they understand, and then they usually are more motivated to start working with it. And well, the e-portfolio itself is very simple, and that doesn't need a lot of explanation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, also changing the learning culture. Well, yeah, that's I think the biggest challenge, because a lot of our education is taking place within hospital, in a hospital setting, where there are a lot of different objectives. Of course, patient care is very important, and not education is not prioritized first always. So it's a big challenge for us to change that culture, but that can be done by small steps, training your clinicians, trying to include time for observation within the daily busy schedule for our clinicians. So it's not something you change overnight, but that really takes a lot of time. But we're making progress with that, and what we also see is that now we have faculty members that are educated within our new program. So they understand why we're doing it. They're now a teacher, and they understand it's important to provide meaningfully feedback. So those faculty members are now also very important, because they are training our other faculty members actually, and our role model in some sort of way. Okay. I don't see any other questions. Francisca left. Alex left. Okay. Well, if there are any other questions, please feel free to ask them on the Slack environment. And I think we also see each other during the on-campus meeting in Utrecht.
Great. I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, me too.
So that's fine. Then let's close this webinar. And thank you very, very much, Harald, for presenting this.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, and we'll see each other in a couple of weeks.
That's fine.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you.